No one noticed when she skipped my name. The table was loud, crowded, warm in the way it always had been. Wrapping paper tore, glasses touched. People laughed like nothing was missing. I watched each gift pass from her hands to theirs. Carefully chosen, thoughtful, personal. When she reached the end, she folded the empty paper on her lap and smiled like everything was complete. No one said anything, not even me. Later, when I asked, she looked confused, almost gentle. She said I must have forgotten. A week later, they stood at my door, all of them, not smiling this time. I have always known where to sit, not because anyone told me, but because there was never a question. My place was at the far end of the table, near the window that never fully closed. In late November, the cold slipped through the edges of the frame and settled quietly against my side. No one else ever chose that seat. It was understood. Thanksgiving at my mother's house followed a structure that never changed. She planned everything days in advance, writing lists in a small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. Ingredients were arranged by category. Timelines were written in careful blocks of time. She did not like interruptions while she worked, but she never said that directly. She would just pause, look up briefly, and then return to what she was doing. That was enough. I learned early how to move around her without disturbing anything. If something needed to be carried, I carried it. If something needed to be cleaned, I did it before she asked. It wasn't something we discussed. It was just how things worked between us. She showed care in details. Meals were always prepared exactly the same way each year. The table settings were consistent. Same plates, same folded napkins, same arrangement of glasses. Even the spacing between chairs seemed intentional. There was comfort in that predictability. Relatives arrived in waves, usually within the same hour. My aunt would come first, bringing something she insisted was necessary even though my mother had already accounted for everything. My uncle followed, quieter, more observant, carrying bottles he placed carefully on the counter without comment. My cousins came last, louder, filling the house with movement that felt temporary. I greeted them all the same way. A nod, a few words, nothing that lingered. No one expected more from me. That was something I had come to rely on. Expectations create pressure. The absence of them leaves space. I stayed mostly in the background, moving between rooms when needed, listening more than speaking. Conversations happened around me, not with me. I never interrupted. When I was asked something directly, I answered simply and returned to what I was doing. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was familiar. My mother moved through the house with quiet control. She didn't raise her voice or give instructions openly. People adjusted to her without realizing it. If something was out of place, it was corrected quickly. If someone offered help in the wrong way, she redirected them without confrontation. There was a system to everything, and within that system, I understood my role. I didn't question it. There were moments, sometimes, when I noticed the difference between how she spoke to me and how she spoke to the others. With them, her tone carried a kind of softness. Not warmth exactly, but something closer to it. With me, her voice was steady, neutral, efficient. I never asked why. It didn't feel necessary. Over time, I stopped looking for changes in that dynamic. People often assume that silence comes from discomfort or fear, but for me, it came from acceptance. The structure worked. It avoided conflict. It kept things stable. And stability has its own kind of value. That year, Thanksgiving began like every other. I arrived early, before anyone else, letting myself in with the spare key she had given me years ago. The house smelled the same, rosemary, butter, something slow-cooked and deliberate. She was already in the kitchen, standing at the counter, measuring something carefully into a bowl. She glanced at me when I entered. "You're early," she said. "I can come back later," I replied. She shook her head once, already turning back to her work. "No, it's fine." That was the extent of it. I set my bag down in the usual place and moved toward the sink, washing my hands without being asked. A dish towel rested folded near the edge of the counter. I picked it up and began drying the utensils she had left beside the basin. We worked like that for a while. No conversation, just movement. At one point, she handed me a tray without looking at me directly. I took it and placed it in the oven, adjusting the rack the way she preferred. When I closed the door, she nodded once, almost to herself. It was a small acknowledgement, but it was enough. By the time the others arrived, everything was nearly ready. The house filled with voices, the familiar rhythm of greetings and layered conversations overlapping in predictable ways. I moved back into my place within it, not at the center, not outside of it either, just present. And for a while, nothing felt different. There was no tension, no indication that anything had shifted. If there were changes already in motion, they were too quiet to notice. Or maybe I wasn't looking for them. At that point, there was no reason to. Everything was exactly as it had always been, and I believed it would stay that way. The first shift was not something I could point to. It did not arrive as a moment. It settled slowly, like something already present that I had only just begun to notice. It started in the kitchen. I was standing near the counter, arranging plates the way my mother always did, larger ones first, then the smaller ones stacked slightly to the side. The spacing mattered. It always had. I followed it without thinking. Behind me, I could hear voices in the living room. My aunt and my mother were speaking, their tones low, measured, not secretive exactly, but contained. At one point, I stepped out of the kitchen to ask where she wanted the extra glasses. The conversation stopped, not abruptly. Not in a way that would draw attention if you were not listening for it, but I was close enough to feel the pause before it settled into something else. My aunt smiled when she saw me. "Oh, we were just talking about the drive," she said. I nodded. "Where should I put the glasses?" My mother looked at me briefly, then toward the dining table. "Next to the plates," she said. Her voice was even, nothing unusual. I returned to the kitchen. It would have been easy to ignore, and I did, at least at first. Moments like that repeated themselves in small ways. Conversations would soften when I entered a room. Eye contact would shift just slightly as if recalibrating, nothing direct, nothing that could be named. During dinner preparation, my cousin stood beside my mother, asking questions about the recipe. My mother explained each step carefully, her tone patient in a way I did not often hear. When I asked if she needed anything else, she didn't look up. "No, it's handled," she said. It was not dismissive. It was simply final. I stepped back, returning to the sink where a few utensils remained. I cleaned them slowly, listening to the rhythm of their conversation continue behind me. There was no invitation to rejoin it. Again, I told myself it meant nothing. People have different ways of speaking to different people. I had known that for years. There was no reason to assign meaning where none had been given. Still, I became more aware of where I stood, not physically, but within the space of the room. Later, when everyone had gathered, I took my usual seat near the window. The cold pressed lightly against my arm, a familiar presence that required no adjustment. Across from me, my uncle was speaking about something work-related. My aunt responded with interest, leaning slightly forward. My mother listened, occasionally adding something brief, something precise. I watched her as she spoke. There was a difference in her posture, a slight shift in how she held herself, more engaged, more open. It was subtle, but it was there. At one point, my cousin mentioned something about a conversation they had all had earlier in the week. The way it was said suggested continuity, something ongoing, something shared. I had not been part of it. No one paused to include me. No one clarified. The conversation moved forward without interruption. I kept my attention on my plate, cutting my food into smaller pieces than necessary. It gave my hands something to do. It kept my focus contained. There is a certain kind of silence that feels stable, and another that feels constructed. This one felt closer to the second. After dinner, I helped clear the table. Plates were passed down without words. I carried them to the kitchen, rinsing them and placing them carefully into the dishwasher. Behind me, I could hear laughter. It rose and fell in waves, familiar voices layered together. For a moment, I paused, listening. Not trying to understand what was being said, just noticing the distance between where I stood and where they were. It wasn't physical distance. The kitchen and the living room were only a few steps apart, but it felt separate, as if the space between them had shifted in a way I could not fully see. My mother entered the kitchen briefly, placing a serving dish beside the sink. She didn't stay. "Leave that," she said. "I'll take care of it later." I nodded, even though she was already turning away. I dried my hands and stepped back, giving the space back to her without being asked. That, too, was familiar, but something about it felt more deliberate this time. As the evening continued, I moved less. I spoke only when necessary. No one seemed to notice the change, or if they did not mention it. By the time dessert was served, the earlier moments had already begun to blur together. Individually, they were insignificant, easy to dismiss. Together, they formed something less clear. Not a pattern, not yet, just a feeling. One I could not explain without sounding uncertain, so I did not try. I stayed where I was, observed what I could, and told myself again that nothing had changed, even as the sense of it remained. The gifts were brought out after dessert. That part of the evening had always been informal, not planned in the same structured way as dinner, but still expected. My mother would disappear briefly into the hallway closet and return with a stack of neatly wrapped boxes, each labeled in her careful handwriting. She did not announce it. She simply began. One by one, she called their names. My aunt went first. A medium-sized box wrapped in dark green paper. My mother handed it to her with both hands, a small, controlled smile on her face. My aunt reacted immediately, warm, appreciative, her voice filling the room as she described how thoughtful it was. My mother nodded once, listening. Then my uncle, a different shape, heavier. He turned it over in his hands before opening it as if he already understood what it might be. When he saw it, he let out a short laugh, surprised but not entirely. "It's exactly what I needed," he said. My mother's expression didn't change much, but there was a slight softening around her eyes. She moved through them like that, each gift matched to the person receiving it, specific, considered, nothing generic, nothing rushed. I watched closely, not out of expectation, just habit. Observing had always been easier than participating. When she called my cousin's name, there was a brief exchange, something about a conversation they had weeks ago, a detail I hadn't heard before. My cousin smiled in recognition, as if the gift confirmed something already shared between them. Again, I said nothing. I didn't keep track of the order, but I noticed when it ended. Not because of anything she said, but because she stopped moving. The last piece of wrapping paper fell into her lap. She smoothed it out carefully, folding it along the creases before placing it aside. Her hands rested there for a moment, still. The room shifted back into conversation. People examined what they had received, comparing, commenting, thanking her again in different ways. The energy lifted slightly, light, satisfied. No one looked in my direction. I remained where I was, my hands resting against my knees, my posture unchanged. There was no moment where she turned and said my name. No hesitation, no acknowledgement of anything unfinished. She sat back in her chair, her expression calm, as if everything had been completed exactly as intended. I waited, not long, just enough to be certain. Then I stood. No one stopped me. I carried a few empty cups into the kitchen, placing them in the sink with more care than necessary. The sound of them touching the surface felt louder than it should have, but it didn't carry into the other room. Or if it did, no one responded. I stayed there for a while, not doing anything specific, just standing. There are moments when absence becomes clear not through what is said, but through what continues without interruption. Everything continued. When I returned to the living room, the conversation had moved on. My uncle was explaining something, gesturing lightly with one hand. My aunt was listening, nodding. My cousin was scrolling through something on their phone, occasionally looking up. My mother glanced at me briefly, only for a second. Then her attention shifted back to the others. There was no change in her expression, no sign that anything had been overlooked. I sat down again, the same seat, the same position, nothing outward had changed. But something had settled, not confusion, not yet, something closer to recognition. I waited until there was a natural break in the conversation. It came when my aunt stood to refill her glass, creating a small pause in the rhythm of the room. I spoke then, quietly. "Was there something I was supposed to take home?" I asked. It was a simple question, neutral. My mother looked at me. This time she held the gaze a moment longer. Her expression shifted, but only slightly. Not into concern, not into surprise, something more controlled than that. "What do you mean?" she asked. Her tone was even. I kept my voice steady. "The gifts, I wasn't sure if I missed something." There was a brief silence, not the same kind as before. This one was heavier. My aunt, who had just returned, paused mid-step. My cousin looked up from their phone. My uncle leaned back slightly in his chair. My mother's expression softened, not with warmth, with something closer to patience. "I gave you yours earlier," she said. The words were clear, placed carefully. I didn't respond immediately. I searched my memory, not out of doubt but out of instinct, replaying the day in small, precise fragments. Arrival, kitchen, dinner, nothing. "I don't think so," I said, still calm, still quiet. Her head tilted slightly as if considering my response. "Yes," she said, "I did." There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, just certainty, absolute and contained. I held her gaze for a moment longer, then I nodded. "Okay," I said. No one spoke after that. The conversation resumed slowly, uneven at first, then returning to its previous rhythm. But something had changed, not in the room, in the way I was now positioned within it. For the first time, the possibility formed clearly, not that something had been forgotten, but that something had been decided, and I had not been part of it. I did not ask again. I did not press further. I sat there, listening as before, but now I was no longer observing from habit. I was observing because something no longer aligned, and for the first time I could not explain it away. The conversation recovered faster than I expected. Within a few minutes, the room returned to its earlier rhythm, voices steady, expressions relaxed, as if the interruption had been minor, easily absorbed. My aunt resumed her seat. My uncle continued where he had left off. My cousin laughed at something that did not seem connected to anything that had just happened. No one referenced it again. Not directly. I remained still, listening, following the flow of their voices without contributing. From the outside, nothing had shifted. The structure held. The evening continued. But there was a difference now, not in what they were doing, in what I was noticing. Every response felt measured. Every transition between topics slightly too smooth, as if guided away from something without acknowledgement. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't coordinated in any way that could be pointed to, but it was consistent. After a while, I stood again and returned to the kitchen. There were a few remaining dishes near the sink, already rinsed, left to dry. I picked one up and began wiping it with the same towel I had used earlier. The fabric was still slightly damp. Behind me, I could hear movement in the living room. Chairs shifting, footsteps. the low murmur of conversation continuing without interruption. A few minutes passed before my aunt entered the kitchen. She moved toward the counter, placing her glass down carefully before turning toward me. "You okay?" she asked. Her tone was gentle, concerned but controlled. I nodded once. "Yes." She watched me for a moment longer than necessary. "You seemed a little off," she said. The word lingered. Not wrong, not upset, just off. "I'm fine," I replied. I kept my focus on the plate in my hands, drying the edges slowly, evenly. She hesitated, as if deciding whether to continue. "I'm sure your mom gave it to you earlier," she said after a moment. "She's very organized about these things." I set the plate down. "I was here the whole time," I said. My voice remained calm. "I didn't step out." She gave a small, reassuring smile. "Maybe you just forgot," she said. "It happens." There was no accusation in her tone, only certainty. I didn't respond. There was nothing in her expression that suggested she expected anything else. She picked up her glass again and left the kitchen without adding anything further. I stood there for a moment after she left, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter. Forgot. The word repeated itself quietly, not as a possibility, as a conclusion that had already been accepted. When I returned to the living room, my cousin was sitting closer to my mother now, showing her something on their phone. They were both leaning slightly toward each other, their focus shared. My mother looked up briefly when I entered, just long enough to acknowledge my presence. Then her attention shifted back. I took my seat again. No one addressed me directly. The conversation continued to move around me, adjusting when necessary, but never stopping. After some time, my uncle spoke. "You've been quiet," he said, looking in my direction. It was the first time anyone had addressed me since earlier. "I'm just listening," I replied. He nodded, accepting the answer without question. "That's good," he said. "Nothing wrong with that." The moment passed quickly, but it marked something, not concern, not curiosity, just a subtle reinforcement of where I belonged, listening, not speaking, not challenging. My mother stood shortly after that, gathering a few empty glasses from the table. "I'll take care of these," she said. No one offered to help. They didn't need to. I watched as she moved toward the kitchen, her posture steady, her expression unchanged. There was no sign of tension in her movements, no indication that anything had occurred outside of what she had already defined. A few minutes later, I followed. She was at the sink, rinsing the glasses one by one, placing them on the rack with the same precision she applied to everything else. I stepped beside her. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She didn't look at me. "You just did," she replied. Her tone was neutral. I waited a moment, then continued. "The gift," I said. "When did you give it to me?" She paused briefly, her hands still under the running water, then resumed. "Before dinner," she said. "I came straight here," I replied. "I didn't leave the house." She turned off the water, drying her hands slowly with a towel before finally looking at me. Her expression was calm, patient. "You were distracted," she said. "I handed it to you when you first arrived." There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a quiet insistence. "I don't remember that," I said. She held my gaze. "That doesn't mean it didn't happen." The words were soft, measured, but firm. I didn't respond immediately. There was a weight to what she was saying, not in volume, but in structure, a closed system, one where her version did not require validation from anything outside of itself. "I would remember," I said. It wasn't defensive, just factual. Her expression shifted slightly, not into frustration, into something closer to disappointment. "You've seemed distracted all evening," she said. "Maybe you're more tired than you think." The implication settled quietly between us, not an accusation, a reframing. I stepped back slightly, creating space between us. "Maybe," I said. It was easier than continuing. She nodded once as if the matter had been resolved. Then she turned back to the sink, picking up the next glass without another word. I stood there for a moment longer, then left the kitchen. When I returned to the living room, nothing had changed. And that, more than anything, made it clear. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't miscommunication. It was alignment, quiet, complete. And I was the only one outside of it. I sat down again, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to clarify, only something to understand. And that understanding was beginning to take shape. I stopped asking questions after that, not because I accepted her explanation, but because I understood how it would be received. Every response I had been given followed the same structure, calm, consistent, and closed. There were no gaps to enter, no uncertainty to work with. Any attempt to clarify only reinforced their version, not mine. So I adjusted. I stayed quiet. And I started paying attention differently, not to what they said directly, but to what didn't fit. The rest of the evening passed without incident. Conversations continued. People laughed in familiar patterns. When it was time to leave, there were the usual exchanges, coats gathered, brief goodbyes, soft promises to meet again soon. My mother stood near the door, thanking each person as they left. When it was my turn, she handed me my coat without comment. Her expression was neutral. Nothing lingered. "Drive safely," she said. I nodded. Then I left. The following days were quiet. No messages, no follow-up. That wasn't unusual. We didn't speak often between gatherings unless something specific required it. The absence of communication on its own didn't signal anything new. But I couldn't let the moment go. Not because of the gift itself, but because of what it represented. A decision had been made, and then defended, not just by her, by all of them. I began with what I could verify, receipts. My mother kept records for everything. It was part of her system, nothing unaccounted for, nothing left undocumented. Over the years, I had seen how precise she was. Purchases were tracked, dates were noted. Even small expenses were written down in that same notebook she used for planning. She believed in structure, and structure leaves traces. I didn't have access to her records directly, but I knew where she shopped. There were only a few places she trusted for gifts. Stores she returned to every year where the staff recognized her, where her preferences were understood. I visited one of them 3 days after Thanksgiving, not with any expectation, just a question. The woman at the counter looked familiar. I had seen her before, though we had never spoken. She greeted me politely when I approached, her expression open but reserved. "I'm looking for something my mother might have purchased recently," I said. She nodded. "Do you know the date?" "Last week," I replied. "Before Thursday." She hesitated briefly, then turned toward the register. "If you have a receipt or the card used, I can check," she said. "I don't," I answered. "But she shops here often. I thought maybe." I didn't finish the sentence. She studied me for a moment, then looked back at the screen. "What's her name?" she asked. I told her. She typed it in, her fingers moving quickly across the keys. The screen reflected faintly in her glasses as she scrolled through the records. After a few seconds, she stopped. "Yes," she said, "there were several purchases." She turned the screen slightly, not fully toward me, but enough that I could see the list. Dates, items, quantities. I didn't step closer. I didn't need to. "What kind of items?" I asked. She glanced at the screen again. "Various," she said. "Clothing, accessories, a few smaller things." Her tone was neutral, professional. "Were they labeled?" I asked. She paused. "What do you mean?" "For specific people," I said. "Was anything marked or noted?" She looked at me more directly this time. "Sometimes customers leave notes," she said slowly, "for gift receipts or packaging." "And this time?" I asked. Another pause, then she nodded. "Yes." The word was quiet, but it settled heavily. I kept my expression unchanged. "Do you remember the names?" I asked. She hesitated. "I'm not sure I should." "It's fine," I said. "I understand." I didn't push. That wasn't the point. The confirmation was enough. There had been intention, organization, specificity. Everything I had seen at the table had been planned, including what had not been there. I thanked her and left without asking anything further. Later that week, something else shifted. It came through my cousin, a message, short, unprompted. "Hey, can we talk?" I read it twice before responding. "When?" There was a delay before the reply came. "Not over the phone." I waited. Then, "Soon." No explanation, no context. I didn't follow up. If there was something to say, it would be said, or it wouldn't. 2 days passed, then 3. The message remained unanswered beyond that, but it stayed with me, not because of what it said, because of how it had been sent. Separate from the others, outside the structure, a deviation, small but noticeable. The final piece came unexpectedly. A receipt, not from a store, from inside the house. I had returned briefly to pick up something I had left behind. A book I had been reading, forgotten on the shelf near the hallway. The door was unlocked. That wasn't unusual. I stepped inside, moving quietly the way I always had. Nothing had changed, the same arrangement, the same stillness. I walked toward the hallway, reaching for the book without hesitation. And that's when I saw it, on the small table near the entrance, a folded piece of paper, partially tucked under the edge of the notebook she always used. I didn't pick it up immediately, I just looked at it. The edge of it revealed printed text, itemized, structured, familiar. I reached for it slowly, unfolding it just enough to read. A list of purchases, dates, prices, and beside each item a name. I scanned the list once, then again, carefully, deliberately. Each name matched someone at the table. Each item aligned with what I had seen them receive. The handwriting beside the printed text was hers, precise, intentional. I moved down the list, line by line, until I reached the end. There was no space left, no additional entry, no variation, just a clean, complete list. I folded the paper back along its original crease and placed it exactly where I had found it. Then I picked up my book and left. By then, the truth was no longer partial. It wasn't something forming. It was something finished, not loud, not exposed, but complete. And for the first time, I understood the structure I had been standing inside. It had never been uncertain, only hidden. After that, I stopped going back, not out of decision, out of clarity. There was nothing left inside that house that required my presence. No conversation that would change what had already been established. No explanation that would arrive late and still matter. So I stayed away. Days passed without contact. Then the pattern shifted. It started with small messages, indirect. "Careful, my aunt was the first. Your mom said you left in a rush. Everything okay?" I read it once, then again. There was no accusation in the words, only a framing. I replied simply, "I left at the usual time." There was a delay before her response came. "Oh, she was worried you seemed upset." I didn't answer that because it wasn't a question. It was a position being set, a version of me defined without my involvement. The next message came from my uncle, a day later. "You've been quiet. You should check in with your mother." Short, direct, not unkind, but aligned, I responded the same way. "I'm fine." No elaboration, no invitation for further discussion. He didn't reply after that. Then my cousin, another message, this one different. "Did something happen on Thanksgiving?" I looked at the screen for a long time before answering. "Yes." The typing indicator appeared, stopped, then appeared again. Finally, "She said you forgot something and got upset." I read the sentence slowly, each word placed carefully, not aggressive, not confrontational, just positioned. "I didn't forget anything," I replied. Another pause, then, "I don't know what to think." That was the last message. No follow-up, no clarification, just uncertainty left suspended. Over the next few days, the narrative continued to form, not directly to me, around me. I could see it in small ways, mutual contacts becoming distant, conversations that used to happen naturally now requiring effort to initiate. Responses came slower, shorter, nothing explicit, nothing that could be challenged, but consistent enough to notice. It was subtle and effective, a repositioning, not of events, of me. I wasn't being accused of anything specific. That would have been easier to address. Instead, I was being described in general terms, distracted, forgetful, distant. Words that carried no clear defense, because they weren't facts. They were impressions, and impressions spread quietly. A week after Thanksgiving, my mother called. She rarely called. Our communication had always been minimal, structured around necessity rather than habit. So when I saw her name on my phone, I let it ring once, then answered. "Hello." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then her voice, calm, measured. "I've been hearing that you're telling people I didn't give you your gift." There was no greeting, no lead-in, just the statement. "I haven't told anyone anything," I said. That was true. A pause. "I spoke to your aunt," she continued. "She said you seemed confused." I didn't respond immediately. The word again, confused, not mistaken, not wrong, just uncertain. "I asked a question," I said. "That's all." "You've made it into something more than that," she replied. Her tone remained steady, controlled. There was no rise in her voice, no emotion placed on top of the words. Only structure. "I didn't make anything," I said. Another pause, then, "You've been distant," she said. "People are noticing." Not concerned, observational, as if reporting something external. "I've been the same," I replied. "That's not how it's coming across," she said. There it was again, not what was true, what was being seen, and by extension, what was being believed. I let the silence sit for a moment, then asked the only question that still mattered. "Why did you say you gave it to me?" The line went quiet, not disconnected, just still. When she spoke again, her voice hadn't changed. "Because I did." The same answer, unmoved, complete. "There's no record of that," I said. It was the first time I introduced something outside of conversation, something verifiable. Another pause, longer this time. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I checked," I said. "Your purchases, the list." I didn't explain how. I didn't need to. The silence that followed was different, less controlled, not broken. "But thinner. You went through my things," she asked. The question shifted the frame immediately. Not about what I had found, about how I had found it. "I saw a receipt," I said. "That's not the point," she replied. Her tone tightened slightly, still calm but no longer neutral. "You're crossing boundaries." I let that settle because it was predictable. When structure breaks, attention shifts away from the inconsistency toward the person who noticed it. "I didn't take anything," I said. "I just looked." "That's not acceptable," she said. The firmness had returned, stronger now. "You're focusing on the wrong thing," I replied. Another pause, then, "You're creating a problem where there isn't one." The words were placed carefully, each one reinforcing the same structure, denial, reframing, control. "I'm not creating anything," I said. "It's already there." Silence, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice had softened, but not with warmth, with distance. "I think you need some space," she said. Not a suggestion, a conclusion. "I agree," I replied. There was nothing else to say. "Take care of yourself," she added. Then the line disconnected. After that call, everything became quieter, not in the sense of absence, in the sense of completion. The narrative had reached its full shape. I was no longer just someone who had asked a question. I was now someone who had overstepped, misunderstood, created tension. And then withdrawn, it was clean, contained. And it explained everything without addressing anything. 3 days later, there was a knock at my door. Not tentative, not aggressive, just deliberate. I knew who it was before I opened it. Not because I had been told, because there was only one way the structure could continue from here. I walked to the door and paused for a moment before unlocking it. Then I opened it. They were all there, my mother, my aunt, my uncle, my cousin, standing close together, not speaking, not smiling, just waiting. for me to respond. And for the first time, the silence wasn't something I stepped into. It was something they brought with them. I didn't step back when I opened the door. I didn't invite them in. I just stood there holding the frame with one hand, leaving the space between us unchanged. For a moment, no one spoke. Up close, their expressions were different from what I had seen before. Not relaxed, not controlled in the same quiet way as at the table. There was something heavier in it now. Not panic, not urgency, awareness. My mother stood slightly in front of the others, not by much, but enough to establish position. Her posture was the same as it had always been, straight, composed, her hands resting loosely at her sides. But her eyes moved more than usual, not scanning, measuring. "You didn't answer my call yesterday," she said. Her voice was calm, even. "I didn't have anything to add," I replied. She held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, then nodded once, as if confirming something internally. "We thought it would be better to speak in person," she said. I let the words settle. Behind her, my aunt shifted slightly, her hands clasped together in front of her. My uncle stood with his arms at his sides, his expression neutral but attentive. My cousin avoided looking at me directly, their focus somewhere just past my shoulder. No one stepped forward. No one interrupted. The structure was still there, just relocated. "I'm listening," I said. I didn't move. Neither did they. My mother took a small breath. "There seems to be some confusion about what happened last week," she began, the same word, placed carefully, consistent. "There isn't," I said. My tone remained steady, not confrontational, just clear, a brief pause. Then she continued as if I hadn't spoken. "You left early," she said. "You've been distant since. And now we're hearing different versions of the same situation. We're hearing, not she is hearing, the alignment held. I didn't leave early," I said. "I left when everyone else did." "That's not how it felt," my aunt said quietly from behind her. It was the first time anyone else had spoken. Her voice carried a softness that almost suggested concern. Almost. I looked at her briefly, then back at my mother. "I didn't tell anyone a version," I said. "I asked a question." "And then you started checking receipts," my uncle added. His tone was firmer, less careful, a statement, not a question. I nodded once. "Yes." There was a shift then, small but real, not in their words, in their posture. Something had moved from uncertainty into acknowledgement. "You went through her things," he said. The emphasis was subtle but deliberate. "I saw a list," I replied. "It was already out." "That's not the point," my mother said. Her voice remained controlled, but there was less space between her words now. "You crossed a line." I let that sit for a moment because I understood what they were doing, not individually, together, redirecting, restructuring, maintaining the same frame. I could respond to that. I could explain, clarify, correct. But I also understood something else. It wouldn't change anything. The system they were holding didn't require accuracy. It required consistency, and they already had that. I looked at each of them one by one, not searching for agreement, just observing. My aunt's hands tightened slightly where they were clasped. My uncle's gaze stayed fixed, steady, unwilling to shift. My cousin finally looked up, but only briefly, their expression unreadable before their eyes moved away again. And my mother, she held her position, waiting, not for an answer, for alignment, for me to step back into the structure they had already defined. That was the expectation. That was the path being offered, quietly, without saying it directly. I felt the weight of it, not pressure, something heavier, final, because I knew what would happen if I accepted it. Nothing, everything would return to how it had been, the same table, the same seat, the same silence. Only now with the understanding that what I saw didn't matter. And I also knew what would happen if I didn't. This, distance, separation. A shift that wouldn't be repaired, not through conversation, not through time. I stood there for a long moment, saying nothing, not because I didn't have something to say, but because I was deciding whether it needed to be said at all. Then I stepped back, not fully, just enough to change the angle of the doorway. "I'm not confused," I said. My voice was quiet but steady. "I know what happened." No one responded immediately. The silence that followed was different from the others, not controlled, not guided, just present. "I'm not going to argue about it," I added. That was the decision, not to prove, not to convince, just to stop participating. My mother's expression didn't change, but something in her posture settled, not relaxed, resolved. "If that's how you feel," she said. The words were neutral, but they carried distance. I nodded. "It is." Another pause. Then my aunt spoke again, more softly this time. "We just don't want this to become something bigger than it is." I looked at her. "It already is," I said, not sharply, just accurately. No one disagreed, but no one agreed either, and that was enough, because in that moment I understood something clearly. There was no version of this where we all stood in the same reality. There never had been. I had just been the last one to see it. I stepped back again, this time fully, not as an invitation, just to create space. "I think it's better if you go," I said. No one argued. No one insisted on staying. They didn't need to. The conversation had already reached its end. My mother nodded once, then turned. The others followed. No one said goodbye. No one looked back. I stood in the doorway until they reached the end of the path, their movements quiet, contained, the same way everything had been from the beginning. Then I closed the door, gently, without sound. And for the first time, the silence inside felt different, not empty, clear. After they left, nothing happened. No messages, no calls, no attempt to reopen what had already closed. The silence that followed was not uncertain. It did not carry the same quiet tension as before, where something unspoken waited beneath the surface. This was different. This silence had shape. It did not expect anything from me, and I did not expect anything from it. A few days passed before the first shift appeared, not from them, from somewhere adjacent. My aunt's number appeared on my phone again. I let it ring once before answering. Her voice was quieter than usual. "I wanted to ask you something," she said. I didn't respond immediately. Then, "Okay." There was a pause on her end, not hesitation, arrangement. "Did you keep anything?" she asked. The question was careful, but it didn't fit. "Keep what?" I asked. "The receipt," she said, "or anything else you found." I stood still, holding the phone loosely in my hand. "No," I said, another pause, longer this time. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Yes." Her breath shifted slightly, audible now. "Your mother thinks something might be missing." The words settled slowly. Not surprising, just expected. "I didn't take anything," I said. "I know," she replied quickly. "I'm not saying you did." But the structure was there. The suggestion had already been placed. Carefully, indirectly, I let the silence stretch between us, then asked, "What's missing?" She hesitated. "I don't know exactly," she said. "She just said something isn't where it should be." Of course, something undefined. Something unverified, but enough to create movement. "I haven't been there since," I said. "I understand," she replied. Her tone softened again, almost apologetic. "I just thought I should ask." "Okay," I said. There was nothing else to add. We ended the call without resolution. The next shift came through someone else. A mutual contact, someone who had been at the table, not close, but connected enough to notice changes. We crossed paths unexpectedly. A brief conversation. Neutral. Until it was. "I heard things got a little tense last week," they said. I didn't respond. "I mean, with your mom," they added. Their tone wasn't confrontational, just curious, observing. "I think it's settled," I said. That was the simplest way to contain it. They nodded slowly. "Yeah," they said. "That's what she said too." I held their gaze for a moment. "And what did she say?" I asked. Another pause, not discomfort, caution. "That you've been under some stress," they said. "That you misunderstood something and it escalated." The phrasing was familiar, structured, clean, no specifics, no details that could be questioned, just an impression. "And now?" I asked. They shrugged slightly. "She said you needed space." I nodded once. "That's accurate," I said. They didn't press further. There was nothing to press. The version had already been accepted. A week later, something changed again. Not in conversation, in structure. It came through something practical. Something that didn't rely on interpretation. My mother had always handled certain shared responsibilities, small financial matters, documentation, things that required consistency over time. Accounts, payments, records, not large enough to be formalized legally, but established enough to be assumed. I had never questioned it. There had been no reason to until I checked. One account in particular stood out, something minor, a shared expense that had always been processed automatically, quietly, without discussion. When I accessed it, the pattern was different, not broken, adjusted. My name was still there, but the permissions had changed. Access limited, control shifted, subtle but precise. I didn't need to ask why. It aligned perfectly. The system had adapted, not to remove me, to redefine me. Less access, less visibility, less presence. I closed the account without making changes. There was nothing to correct, only something to recognize. A few days later, a letter arrived. Not handwritten, not personal, printed, structured. It outlined the same account, the same adjustments framed as updates, routine, necessary. There was no mention of conflict, no acknowledgement of anything outside of process, just a formal confirmation of what had already been done. At the bottom, her name, not signed, typed. I read it once, then placed it aside. That was when the shift became complete, not emotionally, practically. Everything that had once been informal was now defined. Documented, adjusted. The ambiguity was gone, not because it had been resolved, because it had been replaced. The next time I heard from them, it wasn't a call, it wasn't a message. It was silence again, but not the same kind. This time it came with distance that didn't expect to close, and for the first time, nothing in me moved to reduce it because the consequences had already unfolded. Quietly. Through systems, through records, through decisions made without discussion. The same way everything had been handled from the beginning. The house is quieter now, not because anything inside it changed, because I am no longer there. Thanksgiving passed again this year. I know it did, not from an invitation, from absence. There was no message, no call, no acknowledgement of the date. It moved forward without me the same way it had begun to move without me before I noticed. I didn't check. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. Some things become clear only after they've already ended. I kept the same routine. Work, evenings, small, consistent habits that didn't require adjustment. The space around me stayed stable, untouched by the shift that had happened elsewhere. At times, I thought about the table, not the people, the structure, the way everything had been placed with intention, the way each detail had served a purpose, even the ones that weren't immediately visible, especially those. I never received the gift, not later, not quietly, not as a correction. There was no second version of that moment, only the original, unchanged. Sometimes I replay the conversation at the door, not to reconsider what I said, to remember what I didn't. There were explanations I could have offered, details I could have presented, proof that would have forced a different kind of response, but it would not have changed the outcome, because the outcome had never depended on what was true, only on what was held in place. I don't speak to them now, not out of anger, not out of refusal. There is simply nothing left that requires a response. The distance remains, steady, unchallenged. What stayed with me was not the absence of the gift, it was the precision of it, the way something so small could be used to define position without ever being named directly, the way everyone understood it and chose not to say it. I have not returned to that house. I don't plan to. There is no conflict left there, only a structure that no longer includes me. And in the quiet that followed, I understood something I had not seen before. Not everything that is missing was forgotten. Some things are removed carefully, deliberately, and then protected by silence.